I'm now ready to begin the painting process, which I'm going to do in 3 stages. The first one's going to be a blocking in of the masses, and I'll also be looking at putting a slightly more detailed section in for the boat, because that's the real focal point. The second stage is where I'll be varying the masses and breaking them apart. And the third stage is just looking at detail, pattern and texture. So I have my paints laid out here, and I'm just going to prepare the panel with a very light layer of my medium, which is half and half linseed oil and odour-free solvents. And I have the paints mixed out as we did in the tutorial. Now, those may change a little bit as we go along, because colours really just need to exist in a context with other colours. So where we might have made up the correct blue, when we put it on, we might find when it's in sort of the context of the lighter blue or this lovely gradient of blues, that we need to lift 1 or 2 colours up or push certain colours down. That's partly the reason as well why I go for such a limited palette, because in order to sort of push some colours up, if we put it in a sort of a more muted environment, so if other colours get pushed down a little bit, those appear all the more stronger and vibrant. So I'm going to take some of the darker paints. Now I should just say about brushes, I have Hog Filbert brushes for doing the majority of the work. I also have a nice synthetic flat which gives us beautiful sharp edges, which will be good for doing the boat. And then I also have a palette knife for doing some of the texture on the rocks later on. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take some of the dark brown mix that was ultramarine, alizarin crimson and a little bit of the yellow ochre or Indian yellow, and I'm going to draw out that scene again very gently. This is just a guideline, and I can alter things as I wish. Push the horizon up or down if I want to. Maybe I'll push it up a little more. And the good thing about painting freehand with a brush like this is it's very easy to move lines around rather than trying to rub them out with pencil. I then have my boat sitting in here, somewhere around there, and the lines of my sky around here. So time for the block in. Actually, first I might just draw that boat in. So I'm going to use the synthetic brush. Just going to create a small outline. We really want to be careful we don't use too much paint here, because otherwise we'll spend a lot of time trying to remove that paint later on. Okay, there's our boat. So the block in, I'm going to go in for the clouds first of all, which was, it's kind of a lilac colour. It's somewhere actually, one we didn't mix up, it's somewhere in between the lilac and the warm white. Basically I'm just going to put a nice thin layer of this across that whole cloud mass. So I'm trying to find the sort of middle value and middle colour to set in, and later on I can then push these apart a little bit. Because it's so close to the value of the board, I can keep the paint pretty thin. Now, a little bit of care on the shape. Because we've looked at the theory of what's going on with this sky, these sort of horizontal bands, we don't have to stick with what we see in the photograph. We can push this apart a little bit. Let's go now into that beautiful gradient of the sky. So I'm going to start with the good strong neutral blue. So we want to put on some fairly thick paint, plenty of it, but resist that urge to overwork it. Next I come down for one of the warmer blues, which we made with the cobalt turquoise. And these are the colours that should really start lifting up from the background panel. Down into a lighter cobalt turquoise. So as I'm lightening it, I added a little bit of yellow, warmed it up a little bit. Down into the warmest, lightest cobalt. We can take it down a stage further into something that's really a very light green, which is simply the same mix, blue and one of the yellows with white, but it's pushed towards the warmer end of the spectrum, towards the yellow slightly more. Later on I'll come along and sort out the edges on that, but I just want a good solid block in to start with. Let's go in for the water. We have two values in the water. One is that cool green, and that made horizontal bands as well, which was caused by the light being blocked by the clouds falling on the water. Again, we've looked at the theory, so we can use a bit of artistic license here. And the last one was quite a long band that covered all of the foreground, which meant that all of the rocks were, or a lot of the rocks were cast in shadow. Again, this is dark, so I've kept it fairly thin. Let's just step back periodically and assess what's going on, see if we're happy with it. In for the warm kind of milky green. This is thicker paint. One nice little stripe up at the horizon there. So very quickly we can get quite an effective block in, and it gives us a fairly accurate representation of what the piece might look like at the end. All the rest is really just working on decoration, detail, accents and edges. Down for the rocks, we have our darkest mass in the rocks. And then lift it up with some of the lighter greys. Now the next thing I'm going to do before I take a little break and finish the first stage is to paint in the boat. So we had two things going on with the boat. We had a series of whites. So we had a warm white and a cool white. I'm going to go in for the cool white first of all, which was a lilac, and it was darker than the clouds. So here we need to be careful that we select the right value. You can see the one I've put on there is too light, so I'm going to come along and select a slightly darker one. Now if it's too vibrant, we can just tone it down a little bit with a tiny touch of yellow. Just graze it down a little. And when we're happy with the value, then we can go in and finish painting it. We can always tweak this a little bit later on. And we had a little section there. Now in for the warmer white. You can see how crisp and sharp the edges are of these synthetic brushes. So this is our lightest aspect of the entire scene. And this should really work fairly well in conjunction with the cooler whites. To create a convincing illusion of light and shade. We have the same warm white on the back of the ship. And the last thing we need to look at is the colour of the hull. So in reality it's probably close to an ultramarine. But if I just throw ultramarine on, it's too intense. So what's happening in a landscape setting is there's a lot of ambient light being bounced around all over the place. So what we'll find is this this ultramarine, so the true colour of the hull, is being affected by the atmosphere. So our atmosphere is sort of this lilac-y colour. So let's take some lilac into that. Maybe tone it down a little bit with grey. So we have an ultramarine, but it's a little more natural, a little softer than that intense blue we put on, and that looks a lot more natural. Now I put that in. The lighter version then, we simply add some white to it, possibly a little touch of yellow. Yeah, a little touch of yellow helps. And then the last thing is the ramp on the back, the dark aspect. So for that I'm going to take this dark brown or black. Again, I'm going to add a little bit of my atmosphere into it and see how that works. Yeah. If I just put black in, it would be too intense. As the black, anything that's black in terms of local value, as it recedes, it gets a little lighter and picks up a little of the atmosphere. At the same time I can put in some of the dark shadows that I see there and the dark of the funnels. I'd be fairly happy to leave it at that stage for the first piece. That's my block in of the masses done. The next stage I'm going to start varying them and adding sort of detail within those masses.